The banquet hall was decorated with pink bows and silver balloons that hung from the ceiling like a mistaken cloud. I arrived 10 minutes before most people, because that is how I am always on time, always organized, always the one who arrives first and leaves when they have already washed the last glass. I stopped in the hallway that leads to the bathrooms because I heard voices behind a door that was half open, the storage room where they keep the extra chairs. I recognized my younger sister's voice from the first syllable. She was saying that everything was turning out fine, that nobody had noticed anything, that as long as I kept not checking my things carefully, the business could keep running for at least another year. Her husband laughed with that sound. I always despise that sound he makes when he thinks he won something. He said the only thing they needed was for me not to start asking questions. I stood frozen in that hallway with the Sweet 16 gift in my hands, wrapped in shiny champagne-colored paper, with a bow that took me 20 minutes to tie that morning. The noise of the party drifted in from the hall, the trendy song that every 16-year-old asks for this year, the kids running the ice clinking in the glasses, and me standing there without moving, listening to my sister and her husband talk about me like I was a resource they were managing. But before I tell you what I did next, I need to explain how I ended up in that hallway. And before we go on, if you're already subscribed to the channel, let me know in the comments. And tell me where you're watching this from, because these stories travel far, and I like to know how far. My name is Maya Sullivan. I'm 38 years old. I'm a CPA, and for the last 9 years, I've run my own tax and accounting firm in Chicago. I wasn't born here. I grew up in Oak Haven, Illinois, a town most people can't find on a map unless they live nearby. My dad spent 40 years working construction and at a brickyard. My hands don't look like his, because I grabbed books where he grabbed tools. But what I learned from him is exactly the same. The things that actually matter are built slowly with a straight back. We are 4 kids. I'm the second oldest, but from a very young age, I was the fixer, the one who kept the books for the little convenience store my mom set up in the front of the house, the one who helped my older brother fill out applications, the one who explained the new healthcare laws to my dad. Nobody asked me to. I did it because I knew how, and because in a house where money was always tight, knowing how to do things holds more value than money itself. I moved to Chicago at 18 with a partial scholarship to study accounting at the State University. I covered the rest by tutoring middle school math on weekends and doing annual tax returns for vendors at the Maxwell Street Market who didn't know how to file. I slept 6 hours, sometimes 5, and I felt like the luckiest person in the world, because for the first time in my life, my opportunities depended on me, not on the weather or the price of bricks. I graduated, joined a corporate firm, learned everything I could in 4 years, and at 29, I opened my own place with just 2 clients, a college friend sent my way, and a laptop that still had stickers from undergrad on it. In 3 years, I had 12 regular clients. In 5, 26. In 9, the firm has 4 employees, an office in the West Loop that I rent and pay for on time every single month, and a client roster I built, visit by visit, tax return by tax return, audit by audit. The minute I started making real money, I started sending it back to Oak Haven. Not because they asked. Well, they did ask, but I was already sending it before the question came. It was my way of telling them I hadn't forgotten that just because I made it out didn't mean they were left behind. I paid for my dad's cataract surgery when his insurance was going to make him wait 8 months. It was $3,500. We didn't have time to wait for, because he couldn't see well enough to drive around town anymore, and it was sinking him. I fixed my mom's kitchen when part of the roof caved in during a bad storm season. $8,000 between materials and labor. My older brother had a motorcycle accident and lost 3 months of work. I sent him a monthly check during those 3 months so his family wouldn't go hungry. And then there was my younger sister, Sophie. Sophie is 34, and she was always the most social of the four of us. The one who fits in everywhere. The one who smiles with an ease I never possessed. The one who convinces people of things without it ever feeling like a pitch. She married Rick at 26. He sells insurance, and he has this way of talking about business like he's always on the verge of closing the deal of a lifetime. The one that's going to change everything. The one that just needs one last push to get off the ground. I gave him that first push. Rick wanted to open a commercial cleaning supply business to sell to local schools and hospitals. He asked me for $15,000. He told me he'd pay it back with interest in a year. I handed it over without asking him to sign a thing, because Sophie looked at me with those eyes she gets when she needs something, and because my mom was sitting at the same table saying that family doesn't need paperwork. That paperwork means you don't trust them. The supply business lasted a year and 3 months. Rick said the market was too competitive, that hospitals took too long to pay invoices, that vendor regulations had changed. $15,000 vanished without a trace, and nobody ever uttered the word repayment. Then came the second push. Sophie wanted to open a hair salon in Oak Haven. She needed $8,000 for the lease and equipment. Rick was going to handle the books. The salon opened. It ran reasonably well for 2 years, then closed when the landlord gave the space to another tenant because they hadn't paid rent in months. Another $8,000 gone. Next was some catalog clothing business I never fully understood. $5,000. In total, over 6 years, I handed Sophie and Rick $28,000 without a contract, without a promissory note, without a single signature. Every time I pulled out the calculator app on my phone to run the numbers, Sophie would get serious and tell me I had always been too materialistic, that money wasn't everything, that family helps each other without keeping score. Rick would laugh and say that with my accountant attitude, I was never going to enjoy life. And I would put the calculator away because peace mattered to me more than being right. And because I thought that's just what a good sister does. I also have to admit, what I never told anyone until much later, a part of me knew things weren't right. That tight feeling in my chest every time my sister called with an urgent tone wasn't just my imagination. But I had been taught from a very young age that setting boundaries in a tight-knit family is called selfishness. And I carried that lesson for a long time before I realized it was a lie. Everything changed on a Thursday in March at 6:30 in the evening. I was locking up the firm when I got a text from Chloe, a fellow CPA. I bump into at accounting association events every couple of months. Her message said something I didn't fully grasp on the first read, so I read it again. Then a third time. Chloe said she had been running a search through the IRS portal for a client's paperwork, and by pure accident, she stumbled onto something that made no sense. My EIN, my employer identification number, the one I've used for 9 years, was linked to 2 active corporate entities. Mine, Sullivan Accounting Services, which actually exists, and which I file for every year, and another one I had never heard of. Midwest Commercial Distributors, with a registered business address in Oak Haven, Illinois, showing active operations for the past 2 years, and a pending tax liability that Chloe couldn't view in full because it required a password. I texted her back asking if she was sure. She sent me a screenshot. I sat down in my desk chair without even taking off my coat. The computer monitor was still glowing with the client's bank statement. The office was empty. My staff had already gone home for the night. Outside on the street, I could hear the evening traffic and the city bus that rolls through the neighborhood every 15 minutes. I logged into the IRS portal with my credentials. I searched my own ID. I saw exactly what Chloe had seen. Midwest Commercial Distributors, an LLC, registered 26 months ago, listing my name as the legal representative of the company. I had never signed a piece of paper for that in my life. I didn't sleep that night. I drove back to my apartment with my hands gripped tight on the steering wheel, my brain firing at a speed that wouldn't let me process the radio, even though I turned it on 3 times. I sat at my dining room table with my laptop and spent 4 hours digging. I found out the company had 3 employees registered with the State Labor Board. I found out the registered address was on Elm Street in Oak Haven, which is the exact same street where my parents live. I found an accumulated tax debt of $9,000 in unfiled payroll taxes. A company in my name, a debt in my name, 3 workers the state thought I was legally obligated to pay. All of it registered with my social security number, my business ID, my address. All of it existing without me having a clue. At 2 a.m., I called the only person I could think of. Not my mom, not Sophie. I called Patricia Hale, an attorney specializing in corporate and tax law. I had met at a CPA seminar 3 years prior. A 52-year-old woman who speaks slowly, who never says a word more than she needs to, and who, when she asks a question, already knows the answer, and just wants to see if you do too. She picked up on the 4th ring. I apologized for the hour. She told me not to worry about it, that it sounded urgent. I told her everything I had found. She didn't interrupt me once. When I finished, she asked me 4 questions. Had I ever signed incorporation papers for any business? No. Had I ever given anyone my complete tax information for any kind of filing? Not that I knew of, but it was highly likely someone in my family had copies of my documents from times I helped them out. Did I know who might be behind the registered address? Yes. Did I want to stop and think about it before taking action? No. She went quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, Maya, what you're describing is corporate identity theft and fraudulent incorporation. Depending on what we dig up, we could also be looking at wire fraud and forgery. I need you in my office first thing tomorrow morning with everything you have. Do not speak to anyone in your family. No one. Is that clear? I told her yes. I wired her retainer fee before I even got into bed. The next day, I was in her office at 8 a.m. Patricia already had coffee going and a legal pad open to page 1. In 2 hours, we mapped out what we had and what we needed. She filed a formal request with the IRS for the complete corporate file, leveraging my status as the directly affected party. We also filed a complaint with the Federal Trade Commission for identity theft and requested the complete employment history from the State Labor Board under that company name. She told me I needed patience, that these processes don't resolve in days. I didn't have any patience, but I learned how to fake it. The results started rolling in during the 2nd week. The IRS handed over the complete file for Midwest Commercial Distributors. The incorporation documents listed me as the majority shareholder with 80% equity. The person who had processed the registration, who had physically walked the paperwork into the county clerk's office, who had signed the filing forms on behalf of the company, was Sophie, my younger sister. The business address was a perfect match for my parents' house in Oak Haven. The corporate bank account was under Rick's name as the managing director. The company had been selling construction materials to small municipal projects for 2 years. According to the ledgers Patricia pulled, they had invoiced around $50,000 in that time. $50,000 billed under my ID through a company I didn't know existed, carrying a mounting tax debt that the federal government now had every right to collect from me. Patricia explained it to me with the cold clarity of someone who knows her. Words are going to inflict pain, but knows the damage of withholding them would be far worse. They didn't just use your identity to run a business, Maya. They built something with layers. If the IRS had gotten here before you did, they would have held you jointly liable for that debt. If someone had sued the company, you were the majority owner. If the business went bankrupt, owing vendors your name was the one on the chopping block. You were the human shield. They were the ones cashing the checks. I asked her about the other layers. She took a moment before answering. The following week, we found another one. Rick had taken out a small business loan from a private commercial lender, using the company as collateral and listing me as the personal guarantor. The loan was for $40,000. He had been drawing on it for 8 months and was currently 4 payments behind. The lender was on the verge of sending it to collections, a process that naturally would be mailed directly to the registered business address. The business address was my parents' house. My parents knew nothing about this, or at least that's what I still desperately wanted to believe. Patricia flipped to a fresh page on her legal pad and wrote names in a column. Sophie, Rick, my dad as the owner of the property they had used. Though there was no record of him actually authorizing it, which we still needed to verify, I asked her what she thought about my dad. She said she didn't know yet, that sometimes people lend out their address without understanding. They're also lending out their liability, and that ignorance doesn't absolve them. But doing it willingly was a completely different story. I sat there staring at the names on the notepad. My 34-year-old sister, my brother-in-law, who always had that next big deal that was going to change everything, and the very real possibility that the house I grew up in had served as the headquarters for a scam actively robbing me blind. That night, I drove aimlessly around Chicago for 40 minutes. I drove past the university, past the park I used to go to during my freshman year, when I didn't know anyone and needed a bench to do my homework on because a desk wouldn't fit in my dorm room. I drove past the bakery where I bought a plain bagel every morning for 5 straight years because it was the cheapest thing around, and because the guy behind the counter would let it slide if I was a few cents short. I remembered Sophie calling me when I turned 30, telling me she was proud of me, that I was her role model, that she hoped my niece would grow up to be just like me. The memories that cut the deepest are the ones right before the betrayal, the ones that show you exactly what you thought you had, which you now have to reevaluate through a completely different lens. I didn't cry that night. I decided there would be plenty of time for that later. The next day, I went back to the office and worked like nothing happened. Patricia called me every other day with updates. I replied to my family's group texts like everything was perfectly fine. My mom sent me pictures of her church bake sale. Sophie sent me a video of my niece practicing her Sweet 16 dance routine. My dad sent me a voice memo just checking in, using that same calm voice he always has when he's sitting out on the porch in the late afternoon. I saved every single message time-stamped into a digital folder I labeled documentation. 3 weeks in, Patricia laid out the complete picture. We met in her office on a Friday. There were 2 mugs of black coffee on the desk and a slide deck pulled up on her laptop. She told me the company had invoiced $50,000 in 26 months. The tax liability was sitting at $9,000 in improperly filed returns. The $40,000 commercial loan was in default, and the lender could pull the trigger on collections at any given second. The total damage adding up the tax debt, the defaulted loan, and the $28,000 I had handed over directly in undocumented cash over the last 6 years was hovering around $100,000. She paused. "There's one more thing," she said. "We found out Rick placed the company on a vendor list for municipal contracts using your name as the legal proxy. To do that, he needed a notarized document with your signature. We pulled a copy of what he submitted. She looked right at me. The signature isn't yours. I asked her to show it to me. I looked at it on the screen. A signature spelling out my name, drawn by a hand that wasn't mine. It was done by someone who knew what my name looked like on paper, but had no idea how my wrist actually moved to create it. Who had access to physical documents with your signature on them? Patricia asked. Sophie. When I helped her navigate the state permits for the hair salon 4 years ago, I gave her copies of my driver's license, my SSN, and a signed letter of authorization. I never took those copies back. Patricia jotted something down on her pad. Within 2 weeks, we filed the legal actions. A criminal complaint with the Illinois Attorney General's office for wire fraud, identity theft, and forgery. A civil suit to void every single corporate registration tied to my data without my consent. A formal grievance with the FTC and the IRS to establish a paper trail proving I never authorized any of those filings. And an emergency injunction to freeze the company's operations and block any collection attempts aimed at me while the investigation played out. Before I signed the affidavits, I told Patricia one thing. I don't want my family to know that I know. Not yet. I want everything filed, sealed, and stamped before any of them hear a single word from me. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses and told me the exact same thing I assume she tells every client who reaches this breaking point. Silence isn't cruelty in a case like this. It's the only leverage you have. If they find out before the paperwork is locked in, they can move money, shred ledgers, pressure witnesses, guard that silence like it's your most valuable asset. Because right now, it is. I understood it logically. I had understood it since Chloe texted me. It took my gut a little longer to catch up, but I understood. We knocked out the handwriting analysis in 10 days. Patricia hired a certified forensic document examiner in Evanston, a woman in her mid-50s who had spent 20 years testifying in civil and commercial courts, and who talked about ink strokes the way a surgeon talks about anatomy. We gave her the forged municipal document alongside 6 authentic samples of my signature from various bank tax and notary files. Her report was brutal and definitive. My signature has a specific quirk on the initial M, a habit I picked up in high school. It starts from the top, cuts diagonally down to the left, sweeps up, drops down again, and then the pen lifts before hitting the A. The signature on the county paperwork did the exact opposite motion. The pen pressure was entirely wrong. The baseline slant was off. Whoever signed that document didn't even come close to a convincing forgery. The second nail in the coffin was the timeline alibi. The document filed with the county claimed I had shown up in person at the Oak Haven Public Works office on November 8th of the previous year to validate my status as a proxy. On that exact day, I was in New York City, attending an advanced tax strategy seminar hosted by the American Institute of CPAs. I had the hotel receipt from Midtown Manhattan, checking in on the 7th and checking out on the 9th. I had my conference badge scanned with my entry time. I had 4 photos taken with colleagues in the auditorium lobby, complete with metadata timestamps. I was 800 miles away from Oak Haven when somebody claiming to be me walked into that office. Patricia compiled everything into a thick binder and dropped it on her desk with a heavy thud. "This is more than enough for the criminal side," she said. "Now we just need the IRS to confirm they're staying the debt collection while the investigation is active, and we need the judge to grant the injunction before the lender triggers the default." The injunction took 16 days. 16 days that felt like a 6-month sentence. When Patricia finally called with the news, I was auditing a client's books in my office. I stepped out into the hallway, shut the door, and listened to her voice with my eyes closed. The IRS officially acknowledged the debt was in dispute and flagged my file. The company's operations were legally frozen. The commercial lender was formally notified that the loan was originated with fraudulent documentation. I hung up the phone and stood perfectly still in that hallway for a full minute. The overhead fluorescent light flickered once. The rumble of a city bus drifted up from the street. I took a deep breath, walked back into my office, and went back to my client's ledger. Meanwhile, down in Oak Haven, it was business as usual. My mom kept sending me voice memos about organizing the Sweet 16 for my niece Renee Sophie's oldest daughter. She told me they booked the hall, that the dress was being altered, that relatives were driving in from out of state, and that it would be so nice if I came down on Friday to help set up. I replied with a short, sweet text that gave absolutely nothing away. Sophie texted me the link to the DJ's playlist. She asked if I could swing by the teen department at the mall to see if there was anything Renee might want as a gift. I told her I already had it handled. And Rick, my lovely brother-in-law, sent me a text during that same window that I had to read 3 times to believe. He told me he had a massive opportunity with a steel supplier in Chicago. He said he could handle the sales side, and if I just fronted $10,000 in seed money, we'd double our investment in 2 months. He swore he had the math completely dialed in this time. I read that text, standing in my apartment kitchen, my coffee still steaming in my mug. My brother-in-law was asking me for $10,000, while actively sitting on a $40,000 loan he had illegally secured, using my stolen identity. The sheer scale of some people's audacity is genuinely hard to measure. I texted back saying money was a little tight right now, but we'd see. He didn't ask again. In September, 3 weeks before the Sweet 16, Patricia called me in for a strategy meeting. We sat in front of her laptop and she walked me through the complete status of the case. Everything was locked in. The criminal complaint was active. The LLC was frozen by the state. The loan was blocked. The forged paperwork was officially dismantled by the forensic report. "When do you want them served with the subpoenas?" she asked me. I asked her if they could be served on the night of the party. There was a pause. Then she asked if I was absolutely sure. I told her that for 6 years, I had handed over money behind closed doors. I had swallowed their comments about me being materialistic. I had answered their emergency phone calls without complaining. I had been their rainy day fund without the title or the gratitude. I told her that every dollar I gave in silence, and every single betrayal I swallowed in silence too. I wanted the truth to have the exact same stage presence their lies had always enjoyed. Not in front of the whole town, just in front of the family, who either knew exactly what was happening or who had conveniently chosen not to ask. Patricia understood. She asked for the address of the banquet hall. I gave it to her. I told her the place was called the Willow Creek Room, out on Route 47, that the party started at 8 p.m., and that the immediate family would be gathered there early. She said one last thing to me. "Serving them there is going to permanently alter the atmosphere of that room forever. Have you thought this all the way through?" I told her the atmosphere in that room was tainted long before I ever walked in. The day of the party, I left Chicago at 5 p.m. The highway heading out toward the suburbs at that hour has this harsh orange light that makes everything look a little more dramatic than it actually is. I drove with the windows rolled up, and the music turned low, just some instrumental track that didn't demand any emotional bandwidth. Sitting on the passenger seat was the thick manila envelope Patricia had handed me, packed with certified copies of everything: the fraudulent incorporation papers, the forensic handwriting report, the IRS flags, the loan statements, the court injunction. I rolled into Oak Haven at 7:30. I didn't go straight to the hall. I drove slowly past my parents' street. The house had lights on a few folding chairs set up on the lawn. The older folks who can't handle the loud music at the hall usually end up back at the house. I kept driving. I pulled into the banquet hall parking lot at 8:15. I could already hear the bass thumping from inside my car. There were license plates from 3 different counties. I spotted Rick's SUV, parked in a prime spot, right near the entrance, the exact same SUV he had bought using a chunk of the fraudulent loan, according to the paper trail Patricia had dug up. I sat in my car for 10 minutes. I checked my phone. Patricia had texted me. Process server confirms he is in position. Let me know when you're ready. He moves in 15 minutes. I typed back, ready, tell him to go. I locked my phone, grabbed the envelope off the passenger seat, held it for a second, and stared up at the roof of my car. I thought about Sophie at 12 years old, teaching me how to French, braid my hair because her fingers were faster than mine. I thought about her crying when her first high school boyfriend dumped her, and how I sat on the floor of her bedroom for 4 hours without saying anything profound, just being there. I thought about the last Christmas the 4 of us siblings spent together 5 years ago, playing cards at my mom's kitchen table until 1 in the morning. Good memories don't erase the betrayal that comes later. They just give a much more painful name to what you lost. I grabbed the envelope, got out of the car, and walked through the main doors of the hall. The party was hitting that chaotic peak of early arrivals. The DJ was blasting music loud enough to vibrate the floorboards. Kids were sprinting between the tables. The older relatives were practically screaming just to hear each other. The colored strobe lights made the whole room look slightly surreal. I saw my mom before she saw me. She was sitting at the head table with my dad, my Aunt Rose, and 2 of Rick's cousins who only show up for the big events. She looked elegant, wearing the dress she saves for major milestones. Her hair perfectly done. She looked happy. I saw Sophie in the center of the room, talking to 3 different women, at once coordinating something, pointing at the dance floor, laughing. She was wearing a dark burgundy dress that fit her perfectly. She was entirely in her element. I saw Rick standing by the bar with 3 of his buddies, a drink in his hand, leaning back with the posture of a guy who thinks life is going exactly his way. I saw my niece Renee in her pink dress and tiara, completely oblivious to everything, glowing with that pure, innocent happiness that had absolutely nothing to do with the rot surrounding her. I stopped. I took a breath. 3 knocks on the side door of the hall. The process server and his assistant. I watched the security guard let them in. I watched them cut through the room, scanning the crowd for the names printed on their clipboards. I saw the exact microsecond Rick noticed them approaching and how all the blood drained from his face. The process server read the subpoena with that flat, mechanical voice of a guy who does this 10 times a day. No inflection, no drama, no apologies. Richard Thomas Vance and Sophia Sullivan. Vance, you are hereby served to appear before the Illinois Attorney General's Office, Financial Crimes Division, on the 22nd of this month, to provide sworn testimony regarding an active criminal investigation for wire fraud, corporate identity theft, forgery, and the laundering of illicit funds. The music kept playing for about 5 seconds. Then somebody killed the track. The silence that followed wasn't just an absence of noise. It was the sound of something shattering, in real time, the pieces still falling to the floor. That's when I walked up to the head table. My mom saw me approaching. Her face shifted from shock to a brief, confused smile, and right back to shock when she read something in my eyes that told her this wasn't a normal entrance. I stood right in front of the table. I spoke using the exact voice I had been subconsciously building for months, without raising it, without a single tremor. The voice of a professional, delivering a devastating audit to a corporate client. Clear, precise, leaving zero room for interpretation. I told them that 6 months ago, I discovered a business operating under my identity without my consent. I told them that company had billed nearly $100,000 in 2 years, that there was a federal tax debt in my name that I didn't create, that there was a $40,000 loan taken out, using documents bearing a forged version of my signature. I told them that every single piece of it had been documented, reported, and actively prosecuted for months, and that what they had just been handed was merely step one of a legal machine that was going to keep grinding forward with or without anyone's cooperation in that room. I opened the envelope and dropped the stack of documents right onto the table, right between the floral centerpiece and the breadbasket. Sophie was the first one to speak, not with an argument, but with instant hyperventilating tears, the kind designed to manipulate before they even tried to explain. She sobbed that they had been in a terrible financial bind, that Rick couldn't find steady work, that the kids needed things. She said she knew it was wrong, but she couldn't see any other way out, and she swore she was going to pay me back every dime. I let her finish. Then I pointed directly at the county registration form. I asked her at what exact moment during her financial hardship did she decide to sit down, forge my signature, and present herself to a government official as my legal proxy. I asked her if that was desperation too, or if that was a cold, calculated plan. She didn't answer. Her tears stopped for a split second. And that silence was the most honest thing she had offered all night. Rick tried his angle. He puffed his chest out and said, I made great money, that I had a highly successful firm, that those numbers didn't mean to me what they meant to them, that I had never known what it felt like to barely scrape by. I looked him dead in the eye and told him he was actually right about one thing. I hadn't known what it felt like to scrape by for the last 6 years, because everything that belonged to me had been secretly siphoned off by him without my permission. And I told him that wasn't a difference in perspective. It was a federal felony. My dad just sat there. He didn't say a word. He looked diminished. Not physically, he was the same size he'd always been, but something inside him had caved like a building that loses a load-bearing beam. The frame is still standing, but the integrity is gone. My mom started crying, saying she didn't understand how it had come to this, that we were sisters, that family doesn't destroy each other over money. I asked her the only question that actually mattered. Did you know Sophie was using my name for a business? She stayed quiet for way too long, before finally shaking her head, no. That hesitation told me infinitely more than the answer did. Aunt Rose, my mom's sister who had spent the last 20 years watching our family dynamic from the sidelines, stood up. She grabbed her purse, looked down at my mom, and said in a very quiet but incredibly firm voice, "This is wrong, and what they did to your daughter is unforgivable." Then she walked around the table, put a hand on my shoulder, looked me right in the eye and said, "You did exactly what you had to do." She walked out of the banquet hall without another word. I gathered the documents off the table, leaving exactly one piece of paper behind the Attorney General's subpoena with the time and date of their hearing. Before I walked out, I stopped for a second in front of my niece Renee. She was standing near the edge of the dance floor, not fully understanding the gravity of what just happened, but her eyes were wide with the terrifying realization that something foundational had just broken. I gave her a hug. I whispered that this was still her night, and that none of what just happened had anything to do with her. She nodded with that sudden seriousness 16-year-olds get, which is sometimes a hell of a lot more mature than the adults in the room. I walked out of the hall and down the 3 concrete steps into the parking lot. The October night air in Illinois has this sharp, dry chill that drops fast the second the sun goes down. The decorative balloons tied to the railing were whipping in the wind. I got in my car, turned the key, and pulled out of the lot without once looking in the rearview mirror. On the highway back to Chicago, I pulled over at a gas station somewhere off I-55. I bought a black coffee in a styrofoam cup and sat on a cheap plastic bench right by the front doors. The 18-wheelers roared past on the interstate, their headlights cutting through the dark. The sky was clear, full of stars. You can't see in the city because the skyline drowns them out. I sat there for 15 minutes, just holding that warm cup between my hands. I didn't feel great. I didn't feel terrible. For the first time in a very long time, I just felt exactly my own size. The months that followed moved with the slow, methodical rhythm of the justice system, grinding clinical, completely void of sentimentality. Patricia called me with regular updates. The state indicted Sophie and Rick in November. Rick showed up with a private defense attorney who took one look at the mountain of forensic evidence and promptly withdrew from the case. Sophie showed up with my dad, who sat out in the courthouse hallway, his hands clasped over his knees, not speaking to a single soul. The LLC was permanently dissolved by the state. The IRS transferred the tax liability strictly to the defunct corporate entity clearing my name. Once the identity theft was legally proven, the commercial lender launched their own aggressive recovery suit directly against Rick. The SUV was instantly repossessed. My dad wasn't criminally charged. He had allowed them to use his address without asking enough questions, which landed him in a gray area the prosecutor decided wasn't worth pursuing, but he was officially flagged in the system as an uninformed facilitator. His lawyer argued he was a senior citizen with no criminal record who received no direct financial kickbacks. The judge either believed him or decided to have mercy. I honestly don't know which one is true. Sophie took a plea deal, hundreds of hours of community service, structured financial restitution that Patricia monitors like a hawk, and mandatory probation check-ins for the duration of the sentence. Rick got probation with heavy travel restrictions. That massive steel supplier deal in Chicago, it never existed. My mom stayed in Oak Haven. She calls me every 3 weeks from a number I sometimes recognize and sometimes don't. I read the first few texts. They said exactly what I knew they'd say. That she loved me, that I was her daughter, that nothing that happened changed that. After a certain point, I just stopped opening them, not out of cruelty, but out of self-preservation, because there are conversations that simply lead nowhere useful, and learning when to not engage is a survival skill nobody teaches you, but one you inevitably have to learn on your own. Aunt Rose texts me every 2 weeks. She tells me about her life in the city, her knitting circle, her garden. Sometimes she mentions my mom, but she never pressures me, never asks me to call, never tries to play peacekeeper. She just lets me know she's doing okay, and then changes the subject. I appreciate that more than she probably realizes. There are people who show up during the darkest moments and just stand by you without demanding a toll for their presence. That's what you're left with when the smoke finally clears. In February, I started therapy. Not because I couldn't function. I was functioning perfectly fine. I went to the firm. I billed my clients. I paid my bills. I slept 8 hours a night. But I needed to understand a flaw in my own code that no legal brief could fix. How had I allowed myself to become the unrestricted ATM for an entire family for 6 years without ever drawing a hard line? And why, during all that time, when a quiet instinct told me something was deeply wrong, did I keep putting my calculator away just because they told me to? My therapist said something to me in our third session that I ended up chewing on for a solid week. She said that boundaries aren't brick walls. you build to keep people out. They are the perimeter you establish, so you know exactly what belongs to you and what belongs to everyone else. And when you grow up in a family where love and financial obligation are violently mixed together, you end up confusing generosity with your own identity. You end up believing that if you stop giving, you stop belonging. It took me 38 years to figure that out. I don't think it's too late. I think it's the exact moment I was finally ready to hear it. I have a list written on a yellow post-it note stuck to the monitor on my desk at the firm. It says, I do not lend money without a contract. If I want to give, I give it as a gift on my terms, not when a manufactured emergency demands it. I do not sign my name to anything I haven't read twice. I do not carry other people's emotional debts as if they were my own. Those aren't rules born out of bitterness. They are the rules I should have had at 29, and that I finally had to teach myself at 38. Last month, I drove down to Oak Haven for work. A new client who runs a small custom furniture shop out that way. I drove down the street where I grew up without planning to. The detour just took me that way. My parents' house looked exactly the same. The potted plants my mom has obsessively watered since I was a kid were still on the porch. An orange stray cat was asleep on the top step, soaking in the afternoon sun. I didn't stop. I slowed down, looked at it for a few seconds, and kept driving. Back in my apartment in Chicago, I have a basil plant sitting on the kitchen windowsill. I bought it at a farmer's market on a freezing Sunday in January. It sprouted fresh leaves this week, tiny and bright green, stretching up toward the window glass, chasing the light. I noticed them this morning while my coffee was brewing, and I just stood there watching them for a minute for no real reason at all. My name is Maya Sullivan. I am 38 years old. I am a CPA, and this is the story of how I learned that taking care of your family doesn't mean letting them use you as stepping stones. That being generous is not the same thing as being unconditionally available, and that sometimes taking back what belongs to you starts with realizing it was always yours to begin with, and nobody ever had the right to spend it without asking. Everything they built without my consent was dismantled. Everything they forged was exposed. Everything they thought they could bury in the dark was dragged out into the light the second somebody who actually knows how to read a ledger decided to look. The signature they tried to fake was never theirs to take. And that door I pushed open at the banquet hall wasn't to destroy anything. It was simply me putting down a weight I was never supposed to carry. If you resonated with this story, please subscribe to the channel and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and which part of this hit closest to home for you. You are not alone. These things happen far more often than we admit, and dragging them out into the open is the first step to dismantling them. Taking care of the people we love is a beautiful thing, but there is a massive difference between giving from the heart and letting someone pick your pocket while you aren't looking. Maya didn't just reclaim her name on a tax form. She reclaimed the absolute certainty of who she is and exactly what her hard work is worth. Sometimes the most brutal boundary you draw doesn't push the good people away. It brings them closer. And in the end, that's what remains. One important note: this story was created and developed by artificial intelligence for entertainment purposes, while sharing a message that will hopefully help someone out there in their real life. Listening to Maya's journey, I am deeply moved by the quiet strength it takes to finally choose yourself when the people who should protect you are the ones pulling you under. We are often taught from childhood that family means unconditional sacrifice, that saying no to our own blood is a betrayal of love itself. But Maya's story teaches us a profound and painful truth. True love does not demand your destruction as proof of loyalty. When we constantly pour our hard-earned resources into vessels that refuse to fix their own cracks, we are not helping them grow. We are simply enabling our own depletion. I believe the most beautiful humanistic value we can cultivate is empathy, but empathy without boundaries is just self-sabotage, wrapped in good intentions. Setting a boundary is not an act of cruelty, nor is it a brick wall meant to punish the people around us. Instead, it is a profound act of self-respect, a clearly drawn circle that defines where our responsibility ends and someone else's begins. For years, Maya confused her generosity with her identity, believing that if she stopped being the family's ATM, she would lose her place at the table. Many of us carry that exact same heavy burden, mistaking being useful for being loved. By walking into that banquet hall and laying down the truth, she didn't break her family. She simply refused to keep hiding the fractures they had created. In life, we must learn that walking away from toxic dynamics is sometimes the most healing thing we can do for our own soul. You have the absolute right to protect the life you have built with a straight back and honest hands. Generosity should always be a gift, freely given from a place of joy, never a toll extracted through guilt or manipulation. Ultimately, reclaiming your peace means accepting that you cannot save people who are actively trying to drown you. Let this story be the courage you need to stop holding other people's emotional debts, to step out of the shadows of obligation, and to finally stand tall in the bright light of your own worth. Please remember that the story shared today is a fictional narrative created exclusively for educational and entertainment purposes, to highlight complex family dynamics and the importance of healthy personal boundaries. Disclaimer: the views, thoughts, and life lessons expressed in this commentary are for inspirational and informational purposes only and do not constitute professional, legal, psychological, or financial advice. Listeners should always consult with certified professionals regarding their own specific personal, legal, or mental health situations.